Ave Maria, and welcome to Divine Poetry, a series that explores the chronological parallels between the history of the Catholic Church and the Old Testament. If you're new to this concept, go back and watch my interview with Kevin Davis. The link is in the video description below. To make things more simple, I have divided up church history and the Old Testament into 8 color-coded time periods. Below you can see a scrolling bar with the names, dates, and the Old Testament books for each period. Use this timeline to guide you in each video. The color frame of each video will match the time period that we're discussing. Now, let's start today's episode. Hello, this is Dominic, and welcome to episode 37 of Divine Poetry. Today I have a subject that, admittedly, I don't have a lot of documentation or detail to offer you. It's been very busy Saturday and Sunday, and I'm filming this Monday evening, so I don't have much time to edit it, so I'm kind of limited. So I do apologize for the limited amount of details, but nonetheless, I'm going to present it to you because I think it's very interesting. If you remember, a while back, I did a video on the Divine Poetry series about how the history of Ireland itself is prefigured by the Old Testament. Now, of course, those familiar with this YouTube series and also with my website, MaccabeanUprising.com, and all the videos I made on that location, is that I'm claiming that the history of the Catholic Church is prefigured by the Old Testament. The entire history, the macro level history of the Church is prefigured by the Old Testament. But in that video I did about Ireland, I tried to demonstrate that the history of Ireland all by itself, and just without reference to the larger context of Catholic history, just Ireland, also is prefigured by the Old Testament in the same chronological order. And so I'll link that video in the description section of this video, so if you want to go back and see how that works. Well, in today's video, I want to do something similar. I had the hunch that if it was Ireland that had that phenomena happen with it, why wouldn't it be other peoples or nations as well? So one day I was watching a documentary series with my boys about the history of the Kievan Rus, the history of basically of the Russians and the modern day Ukrainians. And I was watching it with them, and I was astonished to see the same system of parallels at play in their history as well. And then further on, we were watching another documentary series of the history of Mali, and I couldn't believe it. There it was again. So I'm going to try to present the history of the Kievan Rus and the history of Mali, both by themselves, and without reference to any larger context of history, are seemingly chronologically prefigured by the Old Testament, just like Ireland was. Okay, so first let me establish the pattern that I want to show here. So the Old Testament, one caveat. The caveat is that even though these system of parallels with the Kievan Rus in Mali and even Ireland are there in a general way, they're not precise. Like there's some moving around of the parts, but there's enough correspondence with the Old Testament to make me think that, wow, this is not a coincidence. And I don't believe in coincidences anyway. So I'm going to present like a loose kind of very general kind of overview of the Old Testament, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So the Old Testament, they start off in bondage in Egypt, more or less. They were founded first by Abraham. I don't want to get into the weeds, but very soon the 12 tribes are released from Egypt, and they go and they enter the Promised Land. That's the period of the Judges. And then after the period of the Judges, you have the Israelites cry out for a king, and they say, we want to have a king like the other nations around us do. And God relents and tells Samuel to anoint the king. And of course, King Saul is the very first king. King Saul does not unite all of the tribes, but most of them. He can't protect all of them. So his kingdom is like a blanket that can't cover your feet. No matter how you pull it, there's going to be some part of that blanket it's going to leave your body exposed. That's King Saul's reign was like that. He couldn't cover all the 12 tribes. And then, of course, King Saul he dies, but also he betrays. He acts in a way that was disapproving to God. And so Samuel anoints a second king, King David. Now, King David is the great king of the Old Testament, and from him come all of the rest of the Davidic kings of Israel until the end of the Davidic dynasty. King David was the founder of the great kingdom of Israel. And so King David, of course, fights a lot of wars and he establishes the kingdom very strong footing. And then his son, King Solomon, builds upon the peace that David was able to win through warfare. And he builds the temple. He becomes very rich and he extends the boundaries of Israel even further. Now, King Solomon, though, of course, he's very wise, right? King Solomon is known for his wisdom as well. After King Solomon dies, the kingdom fractures, and the 10 northern tribes go into apostasy and revolt in the north. And then the north is conquered by the Assyrians. And then finally, the last major point I want to cover here, even though there's more to the Old Testament than this, is that the southern kingdom exists for a while until the Babylonians come and they burn Jerusalem to the ground, and they destroy the temple, and they bring the Jews into exile in Babylon. And now the Jews now have to live under the oppressive. They had to live under the Babylonian regime. Right? They no longer were sovereign, and they had to live under foreign laws and pay tributes and do as they were told by the Babylonians. And there's more to the story than that, but that's the general structure I want to present, because I see those same elements chronologically happening with the Kievan Rus and with the Empire of Mali, which is very, I guess, it's very strange to see that, because the Malian Empire was Muslim. But let me first do the Kievan Rus. Now I'm going to go through this very quickly. And again, I do apologize for the skimpy details. I just had so much going on. I didn't have time to prepare my notes. I'll try to put as many on the screen as I can, but I'm not going to read from sources. I'll just kind of display them if I find them. Okay. So the Kievan Rus are I guess the modern day Russians and the Ukrainians is basically, and the Belarusians as well. They start off though as the Slavic peoples. This is going to be in the 300, 400, 500, 600s AD. The Slavs are a loosely organized, actually you could say disorganized group of tribes that exist in present day Ukraine around Kiev and even north of modern day Ukraine into Russia. The Swedes, the Vikings, they come down the Dnieper River in the 9th century, in the 800s. And they're given the name Rus, right? So when you say Kievan Rus, you're talking about the Slavs and the Vikings. They join together and form a whole new kingdom, a whole new ethnic group of the Kievan Rus. So the Swedes come down, and they have princes, and they're more noble. They have more organization. So the Slavs actually say to the Rus, the Swedes, please rule over us. We're disorganized. We fight with each other. If you rule over us, we'll be much more organized and more efficient, and we can have a kingdom. So the Rus agree to this, and the very first king of the new Kievan Rus kingdom was Rurik. So already you see elements here of the books of the Judges. We have the tribes, a little disunity, no cohesiveness, no leader, and the Israelites cry out for a king, just like the Slavs did with Rurik. Rurik was the first king. Rurik was killed, and then his, I believe his son ruled for a while until he was murdered. And now you have his wife, Olga, who is Saint Olga, is the new ruler of the Kievan Rus. She's the princess, and she's the queen regent. She has a son who would be the king when he grows up. Olga is very ruthless in getting, Saint Olga, at the time she wasn't a Christian yet. This is before her conversion. She was very ruthless. She wanted revenge on the murderers of her husband. So there's one story where she approaches the city of the people who murdered her husband, and she says, listen, I don't want to extract wealth from your city. You don't have much to extract. I'm not interested in fighting you. I just want a tribute, a sign of your allegiance to me. Just give me some pigeons and some sparrows. And elated, the town says, sure, and they give her the pigeons and sparrows that she requested. She goes out that night and she ties sulfur in a fuse to each of the pigeons and the sparrows' feet or tail feathers. And she sends them back to the city alight with fire. And so, of course, when these pigeons and sparrows return to the thatched roofed wooden fortified city, it catches the whole city on fire and burns it down. And so Saint Olga gets her revenge. Olga gets her revenge. Later on, she converts to Christianity. She goes to Constantinople and she converts to Eastern Rite Christianity. At this time, it was not schismatic yet. This was in the 9th century. So the conversion of Olga is like the conversion of Ruth. And her setting the place on fire is like Samson, who did the same thing in the book of the Judges. By the way, Ruth lived during the time of the Judges. So the fact that Olga could be both Samson and Ruth at the same time is interesting, but they're contemporaneous. Samson, if you remember, he gathered a bunch of foxes and he tied them together, their tails together in pairs, and he set their tails on fire, and he sent them sent them off to light the fields of the Philistines' crops on fire. So what Saint Olga did was a lot like what Samson did. Okay, now Saint Olga, after she converts, she builds churches, but not very many, and she spreads Christianity, but not very much. Her son, I believe, I might get this wrong, her son grows up to be king, and he dies, and I believe that son has other children, and one of them, I'm skipping a lot here, is a prince named Vladimir. Now, this also will become Saint Vladimir. Vladimir later on converts to Christianity, but before he does, he's a very warlike king, and he is a strong warrior. He goes and conquers all of the enemies of the Kievan Rus that are neighboring them, and he secures a very powerful and a very good footing. His kingdom's on very good footing, and he rules with justice. He converts to Christianity. He abolishes paganism, and he begins to very thoroughly Christianize his kingdom. And again, this is Eastern Rite Christianity, still part of the Catholic Church at this time. So there's your King David figure, right? He unites all of the tribes like King David did. I forgot to mention this, but the very first King Rurik, who I mentioned earlier, could not unite all the Slavs, just most of them, just like King Saul. Okay, now Saint Vladimir, the great king of the Kievan Rus, he passes away, he dies, he leaves his kingdom in excellent shape. His son, Yaroslav the Wise, right? This is the King Solomon figure. Yaroslav the Wise is the one who builds the iconic church in Kiev, St. Sophia, just as Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. Kiev, by the way, was the capital city of the Kievan Rus. It's like Jerusalem for the Israelites. Now, Yaroslav the Wise is even known as the Wise because of his wisdom and his benevolence and his the way he ruled his kingdom, just like King Solomon was wise. So there's a clear parallel as well. Yaroslav extends the boundaries of the Kievan Rus' kingdom to their largest point, just like King Solomon did as well. Yaroslav also builds many churches, and he brings in education and a better system of laws to the kingdom, much like King Solomon did as well. So then Yaroslav dies, and then this is when the kingdom of the Kievan Rus starts to fracture, just like when Solomon died and his kingdom fractured. The north of this kingdom is conquered by a tribe called the Cumans, just like the Israelites, the 10 northern tribes were conquered by the Assyrians. Okay, fast forward 200 years in Kievan Rus history, and you have the emergence of the great Genghis Khan and the Mongols, who come crashing in from the west, and they burned Kiev to the ground, just like the Babylonians did to Jerusalem, just like Nabucodonosor did. So the great conquerors are coming now. And just as the Jews had to live under the authority and government and dominion of the Babylonians, so too did the Kievan Rus. They were thoroughly crushed and had to live under the vassalage of the Mongols. The Genghis Khan ended the line of kings that stemmed from Saint Vladimir, and they never had a king again, just as Nabucodonosor ended the Davidic dynasty for the Israelites, for the Jews. So the parallels, in my mind, are very clear. They line up very well. There's some other smaller details that happen later. To be honest, I haven't really kind of put them together too much, so I'm just going to lay off and not continue, even though I have some ideas. I don't want to say things I'm not so sure about, so I'll leave it there. But there are more that I see. I just haven't had the time to kind of articulate them and write them down and make them cohesive in my mind. Anyway, let's go now to Mali. This is an amazing thing. Mali, it's a country in West Africa. Okay, it had a great empire in the Middle Ages. Well, there was a king, the first king of the Malian Empire. His name was Soro he was a witch king. He was very unjust. But he was the uniter of many of the Malian tribes. There were 12 tribes of Mali. A little boy named Sundiata, who was a lame-foot prince who was exiled, he manages to come back with an army, and he conquers this witch king. I forget his name. So Sundiata. So first of all, the witch king is like King Saul, the very first king of the Malian Empire. Sundiata is the famous king. He's the great king. He's King David. He's the uniter of the tribes. So Sundiata rules with justice. He also is the one who brings in Islam to Israel, to Mali. This says King David was faithful to the Old Testament religion, so too is Sunjata faithful to this false religion of Mali. But in this parallel, in this context, it's Islam that is the religion that runs the thread through their history. Just like in the Old Testament, it was the Old Testament covenant. But I'm digressing. Okay, so you would expect then, after the death of Sunjata, after he unites the 12 tribes, you'd expect to have a King Solomon figure, and that's exactly what we have. So his son, his name was Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa is theorized to be the wealthiest man the world has ever seen. There was a gold mine in Mali, and he mined it extensively. He had gold. It was like sand to him. He would go on the Muslim pilgrimage, the Hajj, to Mecca, and he would throw out vast sums of gold as he traversed the Saharan desert all the way into Egypt and into Saudi Arabia. He just gave out massive. His train of accommodations and people, his servants, it stretched for miles. He built mosques everywhere he went on a Friday, they said. Anyway, but this Mansa Musa, so he has the wealth of Solomon. So there's that part. He also was the great mosque builder in Mali. So if you ever go to Mali or see pictures of it, there's 2 or 3 iconic mosques that were built. They're still around today. They're very large, and they're built in the style of that place and time. But they were built by Mansa Musa. So there's the King Solomon figure. Now, King Solomon, in the I think books of 3 or 4 kings, he sends out a fleet of ships to a mysterious land called Ophir, where they find gold. Mansa Musa amazingly sends out a fleet of ships from Mali, from West Africa. He sends an expeditionary expeditionary mission of ships to explore the Atlantic Ocean and to presumably discover land on the other side of the Atlantic. But the ships are never heard from again. But so that's amazing that he would do that, just like King Solomon. Okay, so then when Solomon dies, of course, the kingdom's divided. Same thing happens with Mansa Musa. The kingdom's divided into factions, and they're no longer united. And then later on, just as the Babylonians come and subjugate the Jews, so too do the Portuguese show up off the west coast of Africa, and they come and they subjugate the Malian Empire. So there they go. I mean, there's the whole thing. It's very basically you have the first king who can't unite everybody, second king who's the great hero, the third king is the great temple builder and the wealthy wise one. And then you have the fraction of the kingdom, and then pretty soon you have the conquering force coming in and subjugating the people. It's the same pattern for Israel and for the Kievan Rus and for Mali, strangely enough. So I apologize the third time for the lack of documentation. After I record my video, I'll throw up as much documentation as I can find quickly before I need to go to bed tonight. But anyway, I'll see you next week. Glory be to God, and Ave Maria.